They were feared by everyone. Their names, whispers, muted, but with a chill that spread quickly through the criminal world. No matter how dangerous they were or how clever they thought they could be, they couldn't outrun the law. The walls they built around themselves, the power they commanded, the fear they instilled, it all crumbled. Today, we'll take you through the stories of 8 infamous gang leaders. 8 men who once ruled with iron fists, but who met their end behind bars. What happens when the most dangerous criminals, the ones who once controlled entire cities, are left to rot behind bars? Their power crumbles, their empires collapse, but their stories aren't over yet. In prison, they face their final reckoning, and some of them never make it out alive. These men, they built empires built on violence, on fear. They commanded respect, and they spread terror to the outside world. But when the walls closed in around them, everything changed. The power they once held slipped through their fingers. Some died from natural causes, their lives fading quietly, while others met their end at the very hands of those who had once feared them. John Gotti. To many, his name alone was enough to send a shiver down their spine. The dapper Don, a man who could charm the most powerful people in New York with a smile, yet strike fear into the hearts of anyone who crossed him. As the boss of the infamous Gambino crime family, Gotti was more than just a mobster. He was a leader, a mastermind behind an empire built on crime. From extortion and racketeering to brutal murders, his reach stretched far across the city. For years, he was the face of organized crime in America. His name was synonymous with power. But despite all that influence, all that control over the underworld, he couldn't escape the inevitable. Gotti's rise to power was anything but quiet. It was calculated, brutal, and relentless. But as his empire grew, so did the walls closing in around him. The authorities, the feds, they were relentless too, and they finally had enough evidence to bring him to justice. In 1992, after a long and complicated trial, Gotti was sentenced to life in prison for his role in a string of murders and his involvement in racketeering. The streets of New York, once ruled by his power, began to breathe a little easier, but the law couldn't take away everything. Even behind bars, Gotti's name was still a legend. He lived in the cells of the prison like a king, treated like royalty by some of the inmates, still holding on to the power he once had. But time, as it always does, caught up with him. Despite his attempts to control everything, even from behind bars, there was one thing he couldn't control: his health. In 2002, at the age of 61, John Gotti died in a prison hospital. His life, full of ruthless decisions and fearsome power, came to an end not by the hand of justice, but by something far more silent: cancer. It was a cruel irony that the man who had lived for so long by controlling everything around him couldn't control the one thing that would ultimately take him down. His fate, sealed not in the courtroom or by a bullet, but by a disease he could not escape. And just like that, the dapper Don, once feared and revered, was gone. His legacy, like so many others in the criminal world, forever marked by the prison walls that couldn't contain him, and by the cancer that claimed him in the end. Richard Kuklinski. The name itself is enough to send a chill down your spine. Known as the Iceman, he was a man without remorse, a cold-blooded killer whose actions left no trace of his presence. He worked for various crime syndicates, carrying out hits for the highest bidder. But Kuklinski wasn't just any contract killer. What made him different, what made him feared, was his chilling ability to kill without a single hint of emotion. No rage, no hesitation, no second thoughts. His signature was a calm, detached demeanor, almost mechanical in its precision. Over the years, he confessed to taking the lives of over 100 men. And yet, despite the body count, it wasn't the victims that led to his downfall. It was his own words. The very thing that had made him so dangerous, his complete lack of emotion, was the same thing that allowed him to talk so openly about his crimes. In 1988, Richard Kuklinski was arrested. His confession, combined with evidence from the FBI, led to his conviction. But even in prison, the weight of his brutal past never left him. In the end, the cold-blooded killer, who once struck fear into the hearts of so many, was defeated by something no one could escape: heart failure. In 2006, Richard Kuklinski passed away in a prison hospital. A life marked by death, violence, and cruelty had come to a quiet, unremarkable end. Vincent Gigante was a man who knew the power of deception all too well. For years, he feigned mental illness, carefully crafting the persona of a madman wandering the streets in a bathrobe, talking to himself and acting erratically. His behavior was an act, a strategy to avoid the authorities and keep them guessing. Behind that facade, however, was a man who commanded one of the most powerful crime families in the world. As the boss of the Genovese crime family, Gigante was responsible for countless criminal activities, including murder, extortion, and corruption. His control over the family was absolute, but his ability to stay one step ahead of law enforcement was what made him truly dangerous. For years, Gigante's mental illness act worked. He convinced the courts, the public, and the police that he was no longer capable of running his criminal empire. But in 1997, his luck ran out. The FBI had gathered enough evidence to finally put an end to his reign of power. In prison, Gigante's carefully constructed illusion of insanity fell apart. He was sentenced to serve time, and his empire built on deception and manipulation crumbled. But his story didn't end with his arrest. In 2005, Vincent Gigante passed away in prison. His name, once feared across the criminal world, now reduced to little more than a forgotten memory. James Whitey Bulger was a name that struck fear into the hearts of anyone who crossed his path. As the notorious boss of the Winter Hill Gang, he ruled the streets of Boston with an iron fist. Bulger's criminal operations went beyond extortion and murder. He controlled a vast network built on power, fear, and manipulation. For years, he managed to stay one step ahead of the law, living a double life as both a ruthless gangster and an FBI informant. His connections within law enforcement gave him the advantage, helping him avoid capture while continuing his violent reign. He was involved in everything from drug trafficking to deadly hits, and his influence was widespread throughout Boston's underworld. But despite his best efforts to stay hidden, Bulger's past eventually caught up with him. After more than a decade on the run, authorities finally tracked him down in 2011. His capture marked a victory for law enforcement, but it was only the beginning of a much darker chapter for the man who thought he had evaded justice for good. In 2018, while serving a life sentence, Bulger's story came to a tragic end, not by the hands of law enforcement, but by fellow inmates who took justice into their own hands. His murder in prison marked the final page in the story of a criminal whose legacy was built on fear and violence until it all crumbled. Keno Keno was a name that commanded respect in the world of organized crime. As a high-ranking member of the infamous Chicago outfit, he was deeply entrenched in the operations of one of the most powerful criminal syndicates in America. From illegal gambling to drug trafficking, Ito's hands were in many illicit activities, building a reputation as someone who could get things done no matter the cost. But despite his influence, Ito's story is a reminder that no criminal empire is immune to time. His rise to power within the outfit came with its share of risks, and he eventually found himself in a position where betrayal and rivalry were constant threats. Yet, he survived it all and managed to keep his position within the organization for years. In 2008, Keno Keno passed away while serving a prison sentence. His death was not the result of a violent end, but rather the inevitable passing of a man who had lived through a tumultuous life. Natural causes claimed him, and with his death came the end of an era for the Chicago outfit, an organization that had long been a force to be reckoned with. Ito's departure marked the loss of one of the last true figures from the outfit's heyday, and with it, a chapter of Chicago's criminal history was closed forever. Mickey Featherstone was no stranger to violence. As a prominent figure in the Irish-American mob, he built a reputation for ruthlessness, leaving a trail of bloodshed in his wake. His criminal career was marked by brutality, involvement in organized crime, and a series of violent acts that left the streets of New York shaken. Featherstone was known for his ability to survive in the chaotic world of mob warfare, but survival came at a heavy price both for him and those around him. Throughout his career, Featherstone was involved in multiple criminal activities ranging from armed robberies to violent extortions. He gained infamy as a man capable of extreme violence, yet his life of crime was not without its consequences. His involvement in various mob wars put him in constant conflict with rivals, and his time behind bars only became another chapter in his complicated life. After serving time for his crimes, Featherstone's past eventually caught up with him again. Incarcerated once more, he spent his final years in prison, where his once feared name seemed to fade into the background. His death in 2019 brought an end to a life filled with violence, chaos, and crime. Mickey Featherstone's legacy is one marked by the lives he impacted and the criminal world he left behind as it continued to move on in the shadows of his past. Joe Massino was a man who rose to the very top of the Bonanno crime family, a name synonymous with power, wealth, and fear. As the boss, Massino was not only respected but also feared by his associates and rivals alike. He maintained strict control over his organization, ensuring loyalty and discipline through both calculated decisions and ruthless actions. For years, his leadership style helped the Bonanno family regain its reputation as one of the most powerful criminal organizations in New York. Under his watch, the family thrived, engaging in countless illegal activities, each more profitable than the last. Massino's name became a symbol of authority in the underworld, a figure who commanded attention wherever he went. But as history has shown time and time again, no empire lasts forever. Eventually, Massino's grip on power began to slip. After years of investigation, the authorities were able to bring charges against him, including multiple counts of murder and conspiracy. His trial was a spectacle filled with testimonies and evidence that painted a vivid picture of his long career in organized crime. Facing the reality of life behind bars, Massino made a decision that shocked many. The man who had once been at the pinnacle of the mafia chose to cooperate with the authorities, breaking the code of silence that had long defined his world. His cooperation led to the conviction of others within his organization, but it also marked the end of his own legacy. In 2020, Joe Massino passed away in prison. His death was not just the end of his life, it was the final chapter of a criminal career that had once seemed untouchable. The empire he had built brick by brick had long since crumbled, leaving behind a story of power, betrayal, and the ultimate price of a life lived outside the law. Nikki Barnes, once known as Mr. Untouchable, was one of the most powerful drug lords in New York during the 1970s. As the leader of an organization known as the Council, Barnes controlled the heroin trade across Harlem and beyond. His operation brought him unimaginable wealth and influence, turning him into a symbol of power in the city's criminal underworld. Barnes was notorious for his lavish lifestyle. Expensive suits, luxury cars, and bold appearances in public made him both a target and a legend. He flaunted his power openly, even appearing on the cover of major magazines, earning him widespread recognition and the ire of law enforcement. For years, Barnes seemed untouchable, evading justice, despite his empire being built on the devastation of addiction and violence. But his luck eventually ran out. In 1978, Barnes was convicted on drug trafficking charges and sentenced to life in prison without parole. While behind bars, he made a shocking decision that turned the underworld upside down. He became an informant, testifying against his former associates. His cooperation dismantled the Council, destroying the very empire he had built. Barnes spent the rest of his life under witness protection, far from the life of luxury he once enjoyed. In 2012, Nikki Barnes died while still serving his sentence. His death marked the end of a life that rose from the streets to the heights of power, only to fall into betrayal, isolation, and obscurity. These men, once at the top of their criminal empires, held power that seemed unshakable. They ruled with an iron fist, amassed fortunes, and lived in ways that few could imagine. But no matter how much control they had, they couldn't outraw law forever. In the end, prison became their final resting place, where their legacies were sealed and their reigns came to an end. Still, the mark they left behind is hard to ignore. Their names will forever be associated with the chaos, fear, and destruction they caused. Whether or not you think they truly paid for their crimes, their stories remain a dark part of history, stories of men who rose to the top, only to fall from grace. What do you think? Did they get what was coming to them, or was there more to their story? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let us know your perspective. So, what do you also think about the fates of these gang leaders? Were they truly held accountable for their crimes, or did the system fall short of bringing them the justice they deserve? Every story has its twists and turns, but sometimes the truth isn't as clear-cut as we'd like it to be. We want to hear from you. Do you think justice was served, or do these men still have a part of their story left untold? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. And if you're fascinated by these stories and want to hear more true crime cases, be sure to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update as we bring you more shocking and unforgettable tales.